Namaste and greetings, everyone. It's a blessing to be back with everyone here at Paradise. Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Christine, for letting Reverend Christine know to reach out to me. Like, yay, teamwork makes the dream work. So, today we're talking about this topic that so many of us, we really don't like, sadness. And yet sadness is a primary emotion that at some point in our lives, we're going to feel sadness. And yet sadness can be this mood altering thing that is triggered by a variety of other emotions, feelings, situations, and events. And yet, how well do we know ourselves when it comes to this thing called sadness? And I mean, what is it that stirs this feeling to come up in us? And in some cases, one may ask, well, what prevents us from feeling it? So let's pause, because I want us to be very clear on one thing. Sadness is not an enemy to be avoided, a friend to be compassionately welcomed when it shows up. Now, we're going to talk more about this idea of what it means to allow sadness to be this compassionate friend. The Dalai Lama says, the Buddha says, happiness follows sorrow, sorrow follows happiness. But when one no longer discriminates happiness and sorrow, a good deed versus a bad deed, then one is able to realize freedom. And what this is saying to me is, there's this idea, we vilify sadness and sorrow. We put it on this spectrum of, to be happy is the goal, for happiness is the ultimate. I want to be, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. We want to be happy. We chase it, we seek it. We make money mean happiness. We make love mean happiness. We make all these things mean happiness. But how often do we talk about sadness with the same reverence, respect, and place of compassion? Because we place it on this spectrum. Even in the Bible, in Ecclesiastes 3, specifically 1, 4, and 7, it says, there is a time for everything, a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak. Now, what is this telling us? That there's this idea of the high tide and the low tide, the ebb and the flow. Spring becomes summer, becomes fall, becomes winter, becomes spring. There is this ever moving thing that life is. And none of it is meant to be avoided. And I know some folks run to Florida to avoid the winter, but winter still happens, right? They don't experience it the same way people do in Colorado or in Switzerland or Alaska. They don't experience it the same way, but isn't it still winter? So you don't avoid, you are present with. So just like the energy that is produced by the rise and the fall of a wave and this hydro energy, see, wave power can be converted by the periodic up and down movement of the ocean's waves. It can be converted into electricity by placing certain equipment on the surface of the oceans so that it captures the energy and produces, right? So what happens when we are mindful enough, like Sue Morter says, if we can start to think about emotions as energies? Oh, well, breathe. If we can think about emotions as energies that have an effect, that anchor or expand us, then we won't be afraid of sadness, because we will understand that sadness serves a purpose. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But just for the sake of an analogy, we understand that the moon affects Water. The gravitational pull of the moon has an effect on okay. And our bodies are made of a certain percentage of water. What gravitational pull of a circumstance or a situation in life changes the energy within our body for us to experience whatever it is on any given day: happiness, sadness, grief, sorrow, gratitude? What, in the same way that the moon affects the water, what is affecting the energy, the rise and fall of within our own lives? Pause and breathe. We talk about this idea of the tide, and yet there is the emotional tide, the rise and fall of the levels of our feelings and emotions within our own lives. How aware are we of this shifting? There was an interview where Will Smith was talking to David Letterman on David Letterman's show. He has this thing on Netflix, and he was interviewing Will Smith. And somewhere in there, they're talking about Will Smith's book. And Will Smith kept saying, you know, he used this phrase referencing he was angry, he was angry, he was angry. And then he had to pause and say, I keep using this phrase, but it's repetitive. And so he sat with, what is it that I'm really saying? And then he came up with, I'm not really angry or upset, I'm embarrassed. See, this rise and fall of sorrow, sadness, grief, we often displace it and put it as something else because that's something else, anger, that's something else, whatever it is easier to tolerate. And yet when we recognize that this tide, the rise and the fall, the emotional tide, the tide, the acronym that I made is this transformative inner development of our emotions. In other words, our emotional intelligence. When we are effective stewards of our emotions, then we understand that our emotions transform. We understand this idea of our mental equivalent, and we say thoughts become things, and what you think and what you say and what you do. Yeah. But I say there are 4 pillars in the mental equivalent: the thoughts and our consciousness, our paradigms, etc., the emotions and the feelings, the things that we communicate, words typed or spoken or whatever they are, and then the way we show up in action. All 4 of these things affect our lives individually and collectively. So we talk a lot about thoughts. We talk a lot about actions. We talk about be mindful of your words. You have the power of life and death in the speaking of your blah, blah. But we don't talk about emotions enough. It's time to truly move into a space of being effective stewards of all of the pillars. Scott Aubrey says, I am in touch with my sadness that may be resident in my heart. And if we think about, what did Molly say? Didn't she say, and if I recall correctly, it was a Sufi saying that said, our heart is the throne room or the throne of God. So Scott is saying, I am in touch with my sadness that may be within the throne room of the divine, and I have courage to let myself feel it. I have courage to let myself feel it. And people say, but Reverend Ray, if I let myself feel that sadness, it may break me. Yes, and we're going to talk about that. It may break me, but being broken per se isn't a bad thing, right? Pause and breathe. So in this concept of the ebb and flow, there is the scientific thing of a sine wave, right? A sine wave shows the amplitude, the frequency, and the phase of this rise and fall. I want us to think about, because what I always say, if God is everywhere, then God is showing itself in a sine wave. It is a scripture for us to find wisdom. So in the concept of a sine wave, amplitude, there's the idea that there is displacement or distance move between. Okay, so where does sadness displace gratitude or put distance between joy because the sadness is so overwhelming? Because both of them are still within the wave, and yet there are times when we are so focused on one part of it that it displaces, it moves that out. We are no longer giving ourselves the capacity to be both and. There's the idea of frequency. How often do I feel gratitude? How often do I feel sadness? And one of the things that we can easily reflect on that happened this month: mass shooting, shopping, school. The frequency with which we humans, our emotional capacity, we were not made per se to be so oversaturated with. We are supposed to have the ability to give ourselves space to heal. You have surgery, and then there's space to heal. Because if you have surgery and no space, and surgery and no space, and surgery and no space, the body is like, I can't take it. We are meant to have space. So what do we put in place to give ourselves the space to feel? In the same way that we eat and we give ourselves space to digest, to take in the nutrients before we ingest the next meal. There's a phase, the phase between this specific stage where things happen, seasonal phases. We talk about our children going through, their imaginary friend. It's just a phase. It is this time period of, well, how aware are we of the phases that we go through when we are feeling grief, sadness, mourning, anger, whatever that may be? How aware are we of our own changing of phases? There's this idea that the energy of a wave, and yet there are people who are masters at riding the wave. They're called surfers. They practice, they swim into and risk falling off of, yet to swim again to catch the next wave. And yet there are those, they're not doing this on popsicle sticks. They are masterfully riding on a specific tool that enables them to ride, to catch the wave and to ride the wave. What is our tool? What is the thing we are using? Is it meditation? Is it to treat and move our feet? Is it visioning? Is it a variety of tools and techniques, methodologies that give us the ability to not avoid the wave, but to ride it, to recognize that it need not be avoided? Breathe. Richard Rohr says, the inability or the refusal to feel their deep sadness often takes the form of aimless anger. Aimless anger. Remember what I said before, oftentimes it is easier for people, rather than to feel and be with the sadness, to let it come out, to lash out in anger. Because anger, culturally, is a more acceptable feeling. How many of us, we'll get back to Richard Rohr in a moment, how many of us practice comforting others in their grief and sadness? We try to force them out of it because we're uncomfortable. We try to remind them, your mom, Reverend Ray, your mom that died in 2020, she's in a better place. She's not suffering anymore. Yeah. Hush that up now. We need not bypass or malpractice the sadness, the grief, and the mourning, but be present with it. We also need not shift it into anger that lashes out, but to be present with it. So Richard Rohr goes on to say, aimless anger. To get to the bottom of their anger is to face the ocean of sadness that is underneath it. So we can think of a great many people who lashed out or lash out in anger. Jim Jones, Adolf Hitler, Pol Pot, Charles Manson, a great many people who lash out in anger because there's this thing that is unresolved, unhealed, and because it is that, it taints the other waters, the other emotions, the other effects and conditions within their lives. Gary Zukav reminds us that regarding a musician, and I want us to be mindful that we are the musicians. This body, this life is our instrument. And he says, if the musician becomes consumed with grief or rage or sadness, the instrument disintegrates. And in some cases, a broken instrument can be repaired, but a repair at that level cannot cure what caused the breakdown in the first place. Now, we understand in religious science, consciousness creates form. So if we want to change the effect, change the condition, do we know what is causing the breakdown? Do we know what is causing the sadness? Do we know, are we in tune enough with ourselves, our own processes, to know, I have been broken so much, Reverend Ray, or I have been broken so much to the degree that my heart is hardened, that it is like being in a block of ice. It is cold, unbeating, unfeeling, because it's easier to turn the emotions off. And yet, there's the Japanese art of kintsugi, where once the pottery is shattered, you use gold to rejoin it. We understand that God, Spirit, Source, cannot be broken. And yet this human experience, we can feel as though we are shattered and broken to pieces. But when we anchor and ground in principle, then those pieces that we thought were broken, we find that they aren't. Not in the absolute. And so we rejoin those pieces. We rejoin our capacity to be compassionate and loving with ourselves, to be compassionate and loving to the degree that when there is another who is going through whatever it is, sadness, grief, that I have been so compassionate with myself in my own sadness and grief, that now from my overflow, I am able to be present with them. I don't need to say anything unless they ask. I don't need to try to redirect them, recalculating, moving from sadness to joy because I'm uncomfortable. I don't need to do that. I am able to be present with them. Empathy, to be present because I've done it for myself, which enables me to do it for another. That's why when we talk about a world that works for all, I got you. But am I doing what I need to do to make a life that works for me? Am I doing what I need to do that makes a board that works for our community, that makes a community that works for our neighborhood, that makes a neighborhood that works for the city, that makes a city, follow me, the ripples along the surface of the water, the ripples along the surface of consciousness? Am I doing what needs to happen within my own capacity? Breathe. There's a great little book called Secrets of Metaphysics, as told by Clarence Mayer. And in this book, Clarence says, the human experience of life, while not particularly interested in abstractions about a creative principle, it is interested in its personal problems, for this is the human I that may be sick, that is in deep financial or some other difficulties, right? And if this is so, then this person's interest lies in escaping or healing the difficulties at hand and not in the progression of the planets, as marvelous as that may be. See, it's easy to theoreticalize or talk about God as the absolute infinite unity and oneness and joy and all that great good stuff. But I'm hungry. All that great good stuff. God is all there is, and God is good, and it is good, and I am it, and yet there's war, and there are children being shot in school. And see, it's easy to theorize and sidestep into this great and glorious. But when someone is hungry and someone is suffering and someone is crying and someone is in pain, that is where our practice is being called into. That's where it's being called into. A doctor doesn't say, well, there's health and well-being and there's health care, and then they go skipping down the street. No, the doctor steps into the ER where their skills are needed. They step into the dental office where their practice, their skills are needed, their time, their talent, their treasure. Not to bypass and say, well, after looking at your dental x-rays, I've noticed that there is absolutely nothing wrong. Ha, 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 ha. That's just an illusion. It doesn't really exist. God is good. Ha, 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 ha. Yes, I know, but it's okay. Here's my bill. Have a great day. Ha, 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 ha. Right? That makes absolutely no sense. But how many of us within our spiritual teaching do that exact thing? We sidestep, we malpractice sadness because it's all good. It's all God. Be grateful. And yet, feel it. Be present with it. Recognize it. Because both the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu in their book, The Book of Joy, they say the way through sadness and grief comes from great loss, the way through sadness and grief that comes from great loss is when one uses it to be motivated, to generate a deeper sense of purpose. So when we're talking about the shooting at the grocery store, the shooting at the elementary school, the war in the Ukraine, the homelessness down the street from the center, the whatever it is in the world, when we feel this sadness, when we feel this sorrow and grief, what is it motivating us to do? There's an organization of women created, born out of this motivation, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD. Their sadness and grief motivated them with a deeper sense of purpose to say, through our sadness and our grief, we will do what we can to be the Good Samaritan based upon our spiritual imperative so that no other mother need go through what we have gone through. Are we willing to navigate and move through the sadness and grief so that we too, like the Good Samaritan, see what is ours to do? To practice principle at a deeper level of purpose. Breathe. There's this, and I always remind people, God is all there is, right? So if God is all there is, then that means there are no emotions that occur outside of God. Every emotion that is experienced, that is felt, exists within the all-encompassing that is the divine, which means this full emotional spectrum must serve a divine purpose. Sadness need not dictate and control us. Grief need not overcome us. When we are present to it, then we understand how to move through it, how to move with it. And if and when we are in tune with whatever it is we are feeling, and we are stewarding, I love that word, to be a steward, to be the Lord of whatever it is, finances, friendship, communication. How am I wisely, effectively using my time, talents, and treasures in accordance with principle, knowing my highest and best and most life-affirming expression? I am stewarding my emotions and feelings in the most effective way possible, rather than, as I said before, rather than letting them dictate, rather than letting them control us. See, the person who lets money control them is the person that runs around, money, 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 gotta get more. And no matter how much money they have, they never have enough, right? But the person who is an effective steward of money moves into an area of philanthropy, where they recognize that I have, and so I am called to give. It's no different with emotions. When we recognize this idea of being not only in the flow, but as the flow itself, then there is balance, then there is harmony. Then there is no need to shun the yin, the darkness, the negative. We recognize that the yin, the yang, together bring power. Love and law together bring power. Thoughts, words, feelings, and actions bring power into our lives. And it is from that space that we are able to ride the wave, to be grateful for whatever we are feeling. And in that space, from our overflow, compassion, empathy, gratitude, empowered and authentic action, then we are moving greater, further, deeper into what we are called to do, to manifest, to create a world that works for all. Breathe. Breathe. And so it is. Namaste. Namaste.